everyone, thank you for choosing Humans of Authenticity. My name is Vili and I'll be your host. Joining us today is Justin Ponder from Uplifting Impact. He's an ethnic studies, African American studies, and ethnic minority literature professor. I met Justin at the Conscious Inclusion Summit last year, where he facilitated with another outstanding speaker, whom we will meet at another episode. There are two reasons why I wanted to invite him to share his story with us. Firstly, there was one sentence he said at that event that stuck with me until today. When we do DEI work, we should not only focus on diversity in demographics, we should also focus on diversity of ideas. I'm still thinking about it, and hopefully we'll get more insight of it today. Secondly, the way he showed up. Not only he shared his professional mind and expertise, but he showed his entire self with his family, his background, his kids, and his personal stories. And I love that energy, so hopefully we can hear a lot more of that today. Enough from me. Here's Justin Ponder from Uplifting Impact. Hi, Justin. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Would you like to introduce yourself to our listener first?
Well, thank you, V, very much for having me here. My name is Justin Ponder. I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, facilitator, and learner with a firm called Uplifting Impact. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So let's start with your story. Could you share 3 things that you love about yourself?
What a fantastic question. I think that I love about myself my patience and ability to listen. I see a lot of people are in a very fast-paced life or have fast-paced, very assertive personalities. And I think I have a lot of doubt about sometimes what I translate as passivity, but I've come to realize that as a gift that allows me to be a vehicle for others people's self-actualization. When I'm my most rested and well-fed, that's what I can do when I'm my most patient. So patience, I would add to that, listening. And then I've received a lot of compliments on my ability to draw connections between things, like to remember what people have said across conversations or across the relationship and make connections like, oh, does this connect with this? So I love about myself my desire to try to be patient, listening, and to make connections.
Nice. Can you give me an example of that draw connections between people and between things that you've come across?
Well, thank you. So first of all, I realize I have to kind of temper it down because it can sometimes intimidate people. And I think it's just sometimes details will stick out and I'll remember things and I'll be like, oh, that connects nicely with this conversation we had 18 months ago. And then you remembered that? I'm like, I don't know why. And I think I'm just so curious and interested to learn from people that I remember those things. So one of the things that I find most rewarding in my practice is to be able to do coaching sessions with people. So I'm having one-on-one conversations, usually an hour a piece across extended periods of time. So maybe every 3 weeks or every month for months on end. And I love to be able to give people a safe space to stumble through conversations, stumble through questions without judgment, and to kind of provide possible connections. I hear you saying this. Is that right? I heard you a long time ago say this other thing. Is that right? How might these two things connect? And that might be part of my background. When I grew up, I was really into hip hop, like early 90s hip hop. So I loved the idea of remixes and I took my swing at some music making and DJing. I loved making music fresh and new, but I loved even more remixing music. So even my love of classical and chordal structures and everything, I found myself really loving hip hop because it can take this song and this one and blend them together in ways that create something new. So I think maybe the teenage DJ in me likes to do that. I heard this over here. I heard this over here. What might it look like to remix these two things? So that's what I try.
That's fascinating. I grew up with a lot of classical music. Hip hop wasn't my thing until one day I stumbled across classical hip hop. One of that was Modern Mozart. And I think that's the best way for me to get embedded myself into that hip hop culture like ever. And now that's just, you just brought all of that memories back to me.
Well, I'm glad. And even in classical, like, if you think about Pachelbel's canon in D major, or like you think about Bach's Goldenberg variations, these songs that have repetition with a difference. So even in like Goldberg Variations aria, it's the same theme repeated, and it's different and
Mm.
it changes. Perhaps one of my favorite Bach songs is Concerto for Oboe and Violin. It's the same theme and it keeps going through the circle of fifths to different keys with variations. So it's like that connection, the overlap. And I guess I maybe have never felt entirely confident to create something brand new. So I think I like the idea of remixing because I can borrow, connect, overlap, and see what new combinations can be made rather than trying to create something from scratch.
And I think sometimes that's the best way to introduce new concept
Mhm.
to our audience, make something
Absolutely.
familiar sounds different. And since you mentioned canons, I think that's one of the most popular sounds out there because they were able to make like millions different variations from classical with different tunes, different tone, and mixing different style.
Yes.
I got ourselves distracted a little bit.
No
Let's go
way.
back to that drawing connections because I want to get a stories out of that from you. When was the last time you were able to draw connections from something and then yourself learn something new from it?
I think other than just reimagining my hip hop days and then Bach just now. So I was in a coaching session a few weeks ago, and someone was talking about their background. And, it was just kind of the beginning of the conversation. They said, oh, I grew up in a small town. There was only 300 people. It was rather ethnically homogeneous. And then I went to university, and it was the first time that I started to encounter people who were different than me. And we began talking about their professional trajectory and how they had gone about their work and really trying to strategize what they would want to do next. And they were saying, there's lots of areas of opportunity for me to learn to try and understand people more, but I know that I avoid questions that I think are too personal. And I was like, oh, well, how does that connect with your background where you grew up? Did you have to question people much? She's like, oh no, it was very much part of our cultural value that we didn't ask prying questions. And then I was like, well, maybe why was that? What could be ideas for it? What could be possible reasons for why that was such a cultural value that gave so much priority to privacy? And she kind of began to work out the ways in which, well, because the culture and the groups there were rather homogeneous and people were from very similar backgrounds and people had lived there for generations, a lot of that background information did not need to be asked in the first place. And thinking about now where she had moved to a city and there was much more anonymity and people from different backgrounds, that needed to change. You can't just take for granted. And I guess in the social media age, we experience this quite a lot. I'm woefully negligent when it comes to social media. And I've noticed as time has gone on, when I meet people or when I reacquaint myself with someone, like, oh, I haven't seen you in a long time. How are things? And there'll be this moment where people say, well, and I don't know. And they assume that I've been following them on social media, and I find myself in this strange position, like, oh, no, I'm sorry, I don't know. Like, oh, have you been reading my posts? I'm like, no, I'm sorry. And then it's this weird moment where we assume that everybody has our background, the way that maybe 40 years ago in a small town with 300 people, people could assume that same thing. But now that the world is changed and it is different, and we encounter more and more people from different backgrounds, reawakening that questioning and polite, respectful, humble inquisitiveness, as if we don't know someone's entire background story that they presented on social media, is a muscle that we're all kind of working on. And so that person was able to make that connection, like, oh, I didn't know how to do that. And I came from a culture that didn't value that. And now I'm interacting with people from different cultural contexts that think if I don't ask personal questions like that, I'm rude and I don't care. So that was a valuable moment where I was able hopefully to help that person make some connections. But I learned a whole lot about myself, about what it means to be someone even from a large, very diverse city and urban population in the age of social media, where we might assume, even though we aren't very deep friends, don't have deep conversations, oh, I assume you know my backstory, as much as if we grew up in a town of 300 where all of our families have lived there for 5 generations. So, yeah.
That's fascinating from a cultural perspective. I come from a culture where I'm trying to be not to label our own culture, but we don't have a habit of asking how we are. We don't have
Yeah.
a habit of asking how you feeling this morning. Like I remember myself turning up to class, the bell rings, the teacher come in, we all stand up and say, "Good morning, teachers," and we sit down, then we just settle into class. So this gave me some food for thought. So go back to that point where we say, if we say we ask someone about their backstory, what sort of questions should we start apart from how you?
Yeah. I think starting very slow and thinking very long. So slow and long, because, and full disclosure, I'm in the Midwest of the United States where the cultural conversation patterns here, there is statistically much greater comfort with asking personal questions than other places in the world. And there's very interesting historical reasons for that. But even within the United States, places, people from other regions other than the Midwest, I might ask questions, like, are you trying to steal my identity? Like, why are you asking me so many questions? So I realized I have to tone it down, slow it out. And I think the biggest thing is, rather than seeing the ultimate goal is asking questions, is actually to earn trust, to realize that for lots of people that can be very difficult. People from different cultures, people with maybe different disabilities, for which it can be difficult to cognitively process the types of questions I might be comfortable with, realizing that first and foremost, I have to earn their trust to ever even be able to ask those questions in the first place. And second of all, because my background is kind of, I was very interested in philosophy, and I went on to be a professor of modern studies. So from an academic standpoint, I've always been very comfortable with questions. And that was the way that I went about learning. But I had to realize people who might not have that comfort, that personality, or that training might think I'm interrogating them or diagnosing them. So I realize what's been difficult for me is to learn that I have to offer a gift. Sometimes the best question doesn't actually, the best personal question doesn't even have a question mark at the end. It's, I actually start by modeling vulnerability and I offer something personal of myself first. And then I leave space for the person to respond if they choose, and to not if they don't. So I think those were the things that I would give for people is, even before thinking about the questions, which would be slow and long-term game, is to actually first focus on earning trust to ever have the right to ask those questions in the first place. And sometimes the best personal question is I actually offer something of myself and I demonstrate openness, vulnerability, and trust. What better way to earn trust from someone else than to first proactively trust them and give them an offering of trust?
Now you lead to trust, and I think that's another interesting element. Can you talk me through the approach of earning trust with someone that you met for the first time?
So earning trust with people I've met for the first time. I think I've been told that people say, oh, it's very easy to open up to you. I think one of the things in analyzing what I do quite a lot in intercultural communication is I tend to do a lot of mirroring. Is like I'll mirror back and somewhat like unconsciously mirror back some of the nonverbals that I see from other people. And I tend to begin to replicate their vocabulary, their diction level, the speed at which they speak, the volume at which they speak. So that might be something where, I meet people for the first time and I take a stance of understanding. And I love that word and I choose it very intentionally, because it's, rather than I plow my way through every conversation and I'm authentic. I am who I am in every situation and I don't change who I am. And that might be very important for lots of people from different experiences and different personalities. But I tend to try to take a posture of understanding, where rather than overstanding, meet me on my level, I tend to proceed slowly and say, hey, let's see how these things are going. So I can stand under you in a posture to receive and try to learn what you have to offer and meet you where you are. And I think that's the core of what empathy is. I think we get into problems where we think empathy is or even understanding is an intellectual exercise. I'm walking down the street. I see someone trip and fall. I feel bad for them because I imagine the last time that I tripped and fell, and I know how bad it felt for me to do so. So I assume them tripping and falling, they feel as bad as I would feel. And I absolve myself because I feel bad, as opposed to going a little bit further and going forward and saying, no, I'm actually demonstrating compassion. I'm working with you. I have an external, outward expression of care, of kindness, and that I'm trying to understand you rather than just assuming, oh, I would feel this way, so you must feel this way. And I keep making myself the center of the universe. So that's what I think are some of the things that I try the most, is to demonstrate I'm trying to understand you. I'm trying to make sure that you are centered. I care for you. And another thing, and when it comes to mirroring beyond just the nonverbals, I'm working on putting away my philosopher's cap that asks a bunch of questions, because in addition to being maybe off-putting and some people think I'm trying to diagnose them, it can also give the message that I'm trying to get to a deeper, profounder truth beyond the person in front of me, that they are simply a vehicle to some great philosophical truth beyond them. And I'm working quite a lot on trying to mirroring back. I hear you saying this. Is this accurate? So instead of like a philosopher trying to get to some deeper truth with probing questions that go down, I'm trying to do more and more almost like a journalist. Like, so is this accurate? Am I understanding this correctly? To simply show to people, this is what I heard you say. I'm trying to understand you. Am I understanding you correctly?
I think we're slowly moving towards empathy, and we'll get there shortly.
Yeah.
I do want to go back to that story with one more question. So
Yeah.
as you're mirroring the person, do you feel that you might get lost in that dynamic?
No, I personally don't. But I know that that's among some of the primary questions that I get from people. So I'm like, no, I don't feel that, but maybe I should be worried about that. And this is where I say it depends. Another part of my background that I think is very profound and transformative in making who I am and my perspective is a few things. One, I'm in the United States. My father is Black, my mother is white. So I am among the first generation of children from constitutionally Black-white protected intermarriages. Those were not constitutionally protected in the United States till 1967. So when you have such a long historical and socially constructed divide, I was born in the middle. So my entire life has always been an experience of being betwixt and between, and being kind of the chameleon that is the way of life, is adapting and trying to understand, and never entirely having an entire social group the way that is understood in the United States, with a consistent and fairly coherent unifying social experience and cultural practices and language and geographical proximity. Black, white, mixed folks in the United States don't have that. They might be like, oh, a similar experience, but it's like, oh, I live here, I live here. It's not like, oh, this is the Black, white, mixed town in the state. It's alienation even within the family. It's like, I don't even share the same racial background as my parents. So I think I've had kind of an inordinate experience that's thrown me into, you're always kind of between. On top of that, I was part of a integration busing program that was a federal integration busing program to break up racial segregation in Wisconsin. So I lived in a predominantly Black neighborhood, went to a almost entirely white school. So this is an entire experience of being between worlds. And I'm thinking about the term code switching, but I know the kind of intellectual baggage it can have for lots of people about, and very harmful history it can have for many people, of feeling I know who I am. I am comfortable with who I am and my history and my group. And this is forced inauthenticity that I come to work every single day and I have to check this part of my identity at the door. So I feel my particular background has informed and given me maybe a greater comfort with adaptability and not a fear of losing myself, and maybe not even losing myself because there was never as firmly rooted self to lose in the first place, if that makes sense. So I never felt that extreme discomfort, but I know many people do. And I'm still trying to figure out why. Like I'm trying to figure out like why and should I have more concern and being asserting myself more and be like, no, you're going to meet the conversation on my terms more than I do. But that's a possible way of looking at things that I humbly offer to your listeners to consider.
You just read my mind because I had that exact questions. Like, do you ever at any point in between different groups feel any sort of identity crisis where, let me reframe the questions. Do you ever feel that you need to fit in when you interact with these different groups?
I
Because
don't
I think
know.
that's the root cause of code switching. We try to fit in, hence we behave differently depending on the groups that we socialize with.
Yeah, I think I still have, and I credit my father for this, making sure that we had a very strong sense of individual identity, of culture, of history. So the larger social context, it wasn't just like, just be who you are and don't care about these other groups. It was, no, this is your history, the history of the people and the families that make you. This is the history of the context in which you live. But also making sure that we had kind of a individual moral compass that allowed me to have a greater comfort about the things that I was doing, whether or not it was a trade-off or a cop-out. And realizing the things that I would not sacrifice versus the things that were worth negotiating in the moment for some greater good. So I've never felt, I mean, there's obviously moments of failure and moments of regret, but very rarely do I feel like I'm compromising myself in the sense that I am lying and being dishonest to who I am and my core values or what's worth fighting for. But with that, like very strong sense of, no, these are my core. I've been much more comfortable with being negotiating things that were further out from the core. And with that, part of my core is helping people understand themselves and understand others and understand the world in ways that they might not have the luxury of doing. Like I understand even the experience that I laid out for you, that's a very privileged one. That gives me experiences, lessons that I would not have chosen, that I did not seek out in all my infinite wisdom. They were things that happened to me that produce lessons that are kind of unusual. So it's my duty and honor to be respectful, patient, and curious about other people and being kind of like that Socratic gadfly that just asks a whole lot of questions
Hmm.
so people reflect on who they are. So I've always, I think maybe the answer of have I been concerned about being inauthentic or lying or code switching? It's always been very much like curiosity has always been the front compass. I'm like, wait, I'm trying to understand who I am in light of you and then understand who you are and understand who we are together in this temporary combination that has never existed before and won't exist again. So
Hmm.
who are the we together?
This is fascinating. So I want to, okay, let's go for it. Because I think we get to the gist of this podcast now, that individualized identity.
Mhm.
So you mentioned that you know your core values, you know that you would not sacrifice it for whatever reasons. The question is, how do you know for sure it's worth holding on?
For me, I feel and I think I'm trying to think about what can do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And again, part of my background has been being a professor. I got my PhD in modern studies, focusing on the ethics of mixed race identity and precisely about how identification can help combat racial bigotry, and maybe even erode the assumptions that cause racial inequity in the United States. So I had a whole doctorate thesis focusing on this and had the luxury of being able to hammer this out over years and years and think about it. And I see the ways in which the history of racial segregation in the United States, and we could see even maybe the digital segregation that happens now in the United States as well, as producing echo chambers and filter bubbles where it becomes harder to understand difference. And it becomes harder to enact perhaps the largest sense of true, authentic love, which for me, I can only really truly show love. And this is borrowing from Kierkegaard. I can only really truly show love to anyone it's hard for me to love. The second it becomes easy for me to love that person, I'm doing kindness and it's nice, but as soon as it becomes self-rewarding, it's not necessarily the highest love anymore. So going throughout my career, I taught in rural Wisconsin in many different institutions in rural Wisconsin, where I was the first Black person that they ever encountered. Most of my students ever encountered, much less first Black intellectual, first Black academic, teacher, authority figure. And I was teaching classes on race that they had never talked about before. So I understood and I experienced firsthand across thousands of people across many years the anxiety and fear that comes from that, where I thought I knew everything. And I was surrounded by people who walk like me, talk like me, think like me, stink like me, who told me this is the truth, this is the truth, this is the truth. And then to step outside of that, it causes very deep and somewhat known anxiety and fear that my entire background, my entire training has limited me. And I don't know if I have the energy, the courage, the willingness to challenge all those things. To do so is almost to undo myself. So the greatest good that I can do for the most number of people is realize, hey, Justin, you didn't necessarily have the same firm ground that other people have to develop very deep roots. So you can nudge people gently to question their roots without yanking them out of the ground because they're expecting that threat. They're expecting a fight as opposed to some gentle, patient, compassionate questioning that seeks their greatest good and to nudge them towards higher feelings of understanding, even when they don't want to. It's not to fight them, and it's not to prove that I'm right and to prove that they are wrong. It's to come to a greater level of truth that can only exist between me and that person in this moment that I could not have on my own. That is an enormous gift from them in my presence in the temporary moment. So I have an ethical obligation to them, even if it's full of bigotry and vitriol and pain and infuriating anger. There is also kind of a cosmic gift in that moment that I owe it to them to save them from themselves and provide a larger context. One of my heroes is Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists who trick people into teaching them how to read and write, escape from slavery only to go back into it and argue against it and for the abolition of it. And he talks frequently about, hey, my entire mission is to save the bodies of Black enslaved people, but it is also to save the soul of the slavers. And there's something that very much sticks with me with that is seeing this obligation to provide other forms of understanding and thinking for people who otherwise would not on their own.
There are so many things I want to unpack from that. I can see a lot of patience demonstrating that stories coming from you. I hear that you were the first in the space, and I could then immediately see that being the first of any individual in any space put a lot of pressure on you, not only to perform and do our work well, but also because we become that one representation point for the entire demographics. So I want to applaud you for your bravery in working through all of that dynamic. We might come
Well,
back.
I want to interject. I mess it up all the time. I get it wrong a lot. And in the moment, I have to constantly wonder, am I being ethically virtuistic and altruistic in my patience, or am I being cowardly? Am I just simply operating on autopilot of politeness and manners? Or am I consciously and intentionally and mindfully enacting this form of compassion? And then after interactions, I am always consumed with doubt. And I'm consumed with sadness, and I'm consumed with fear. Because I'll leave situations and I'm like, what background and what framework would inspire someone to think that, to want to say that, and to think it would be okay to say that? Did they not know how hurtful that would be? And so I'll go through very deep fits of, I must not understand this, and I must not understand other people very well. So I do not want to give the impression that I've got this figured out, because I'll leave the situation and be full of doubt, fear, sadness, and hurt. But then I'll find myself being like, okay, and I don't think that this is a way to go for everyone, but I know that it is a way that seems natural to me, one. And two, I know in many spaces that I am in, it does not seem that many are taking this path. So I'm not saying it is not better, and it is not, it is a team approach, and there are many different players on the team who have different approaches. This happens to be mine by personality, by life experience, by training, and by choice. I don't know how effective it is. I definitely know it is not the only one, and I definitely know it is not better. So it is an option for your consideration.
Of course, and I guess that's what I feel so unfair about it, because this is me in this space. I know that I'm the first, but this is how I'm doing with it.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, that me become the representations of my groups, and that's really unfair. But I don't think we have another choice to it. So yeah, I just give me goosebumps. Let's move to the second part of the episode today, and let's unpack your chosen keywords. So I provided you a list of 12. Which one did you select?
I selected empathy.
And can you explain what empathy means for you?
Well, empathy means for me, and I think it was something that very much kind of guided my professional career as well, is wanting to develop other people's empathy. Like, oh, all these social ills, all these problems are because of, I assumed, a lack of empathy. And so if I can teach people and create environments to expand empathy, it can change things. In Gandhi's experiments in Satyagraha, he talks about truth power, which is what he called Satyagraha, the nonviolent social interaction and social nonviolent resistance. That when the British, then the most powerful military force in the world, was an imperial force in India, able to fight for Indian independence without the kind of military violence that was seen in other colonial independence movements. And his argument was, there's a core in humans, and even in people who contribute to oppression, that is hardwired to empathize. And empathy is present in everyone, even the worst dictators, the worst despots, the worst tyrants, the worst oppressive people. Quite often in my work and talking to people who espouse openly very deep forms of bigotry and chauvinism of all kinds, I wonder the extent to which it becomes easy to say, oh, there, it's out of hate, but it is also out of love. The hate of that group over there is almost very often eclipsed by, oh, I'm not hating them, I'm loving my group very strongly and very deeply. So I have very deep empathy, but my empathy is very profound and very deep and very strong, but it is only to my group, and it is too narrow. So even the worst tyrants have a puppy. They show love and empathy to something. They have friends, they have family. And Gandhi's thesis was, we just have to find ways to widen that out to others. So that's why I chose empathy. And it means to me this, it literally translates as in feeling, as being able to feel into something. And the idea to feel kindness, love, compassion for others, these are all things that are valuable for empathy. There's a lot of, we'll probably pick apart overlap and similarities and dissimilar between it. So I think it is a very important crown jewel of virtues for our time, even though there's plenty of problems and limitations with it. So.
Here's one thing you say that I found very fascinating. You mentioned that empathy presents in everyone, but why is it sometimes hidden so well that we couldn't bring it out?
And I think it's important to note that it manifests in different ways. So empathy, we think of quite often, well, if you think about an evolutionary psychology perspective for human evolution and psychology, humans, in comparison to many animals, are much more communal creatures. We don't do very well on our own. So it becomes very much the instinct of humans to connect for survival. So if you think about, I use the example of a puppy. I can get a puppy at 3 days old and take the puppy into my house, and it can be not raised by any other dogs, and it will grow, and instinct will teach it, even without instruction from other dogs, how to be a dog. Humans do not have that same thing. We are very much hardwired to learn from other humans. So whatever instincts we don't have that will naturally teach us whatever we need to know, our instinct becomes learn from other people, connect with them, feel for them, and be part of them. And we think about through evolutionary history, it becomes a threat to not be able to understand other humans, to connect with them, to feel compassion for them, and to get them to feel compassion for you. Because what would that mean? That would mean, oh, you get the last of the friends and family, the last of partners, the last of food and resources. You have to live on the edge of the village, which makes you most susceptible to disease, to famine, to attacks from other people. So from across this history, we have very much a biological imperative. Figure out what other people are feeling and find ways to fit into the group. But as it becomes, and we live more and more in a society with difference, it becomes very easy to say, okay, I need empathy with just this very small group. Gone are the days where we live in a village of 150 people and there's no one else for miles. We live in all kinds of communities and overlap. So it becomes it becomes a very strong motivation to say, who's my community in spite of all the other communities I'm around? And it becomes almost the flaw of the human brain. We don't know what a thing is as much as we know all the things it is not. And we develop more clarity, not in the thing in and of itself, but in its opposition to other things. There are more antonyms to a thing than there are synonyms for it. So we understand ideas in relationship to other things, and we understand ourselves in relationship to our friends, our family, our community. But within that community, there's all kinds of messy difference and confusion and ambiguity. But all that goes and snaps away into clarity once we define ourselves against them. So if you think about, like, no matter where you work, a great way to start bonding is quite often coworkers. I don't know anything. I'm new here and I know we have problems. Let's both complain about somebody else. Oh, we immediately bond. And there's a lot of really interesting work done on the social psychology of gossip, that it becomes a way for me to bond and learn and interpret stories about human characters in our lives. And I think when it comes to why we push it down and why we can push it down is, we mentioned kind of it, like we live in the echo chamber, filter bubbles of where our perspective of reality the wells from which we draw meaning and information are much more siloed. We don't share as much. We're not going to use, again, the metaphor of the clan, my 150 in my village versus the 150 that are miles away. The opportunity that we trade or have common watering holes is less and less. So the places where we would accidentally interact with someone different, even though we might be working alongside them, when we look for meaning, we look for information, when we're watching social media, or we're looking for information, it becomes easier and easier to turn into ourselves and not be interacting with others accidentally in ways that cause us to grow.
I guess there are two things I love from that. From what you've just shared. The first one is the wealth from which we gather information these days becomes so siloed.
Yeah.
And I guess, internet and social medias and different platforms has a lot to contribute to that. But the second thing is this concept of our village versus the rest of the world. And all of a sudden I has this idea of, if we can reframe the conversation so that we turn the world to become our village, does it mean that we now can expand our empathy and we can feel each other and we can be a lot more peace.
I hope, I wish. But if we look at what psychologists, human group psychologists, and evolutionary psychologists think, there's, in a nutshell, the thesis is, oh, the greatest thing that could happen to unify humans is an alien invasion from another planet. Because the greatest, and part of it isn't like how terrible and evil humans are. It's part of it is the cognitive limitations of how a human brain thinks. It thinks about who do I love? And also like, who do I not have to love? Because that sounds exhausting. So what are the limitations of the love I have to give? Oh, okay, so here's the limits. All right, I will be better at loving my in group because I know where I get to stop.
Mm.
And so you have this mention like the global village. That would make sense if we know anything from history. It would make sense in the human brain once the global human village could define itself into some other, in opposition to some other group. So we'd be like, yes, we are all humans and we are not Martians. And the Martians are, so we can come together as a cause. And I think the ultimate challenge of empathy is defining with as opposed to defining against.
Mm.
And almost developing like defying all of the way that the human brain is evolutionarily set up to think, to be able to find comfort in the ambiguity, to find definition with rather than, okay, so who are we against? Rather than what are we fighting against? Be like, wait, what are we about as a whole? And that's very hard to do.
So let's go back to a more practical starting point.
Mhm.
If you are teaching a kids on the emotion of empathy, how would you explain it to them?
Like how to demonstrate empathy. I think first, more important than feeling internal empathy. And I think that can be a stumbling block because a lot of people, I watched this movie about an underprivileged group experiencing oppression that I didn't understand, and I felt bad. I'm done. So, I mean, the root word, one of the root words in empathy is pathos, is the feeling of strong emotions. And that can be a great difficulty to overcome because we can be convinced I felt something that is the end of my ethical responsibility. And the people we feel for have no benefit from the internal feeling that we felt. We cried some tears. It does not help the people we cried for. So when it comes to going beyond empathy, beyond just simply feeling internally and demonstrating compassion to others, I think it starts with the understanding we were talking about. Like I will seek to make you my center. I will seek to try to understand the world on your terms, and I will try to hear you. Oftentimes we skip past that to say, I felt something, so I understand how you feel. Or I will seek to take a posture of standing under you. We will confuse that with, oh no, I get it. I understand you. Like, really? I don't know myself. How am I going to understand somebody else? Like, oh, I get it. I get it. No, it's this posture of perpetually understanding, perpetually standing under, waiting to learn from and learning with. And we often get very uncomfortable with that and say, well, what good does that do? I'm going to jump to serving them, which falls into saviorism. And we can see it, and you can fill in for yourselves all kinds of examples in which I feel bad for a group I don't belong to. I will ally with them by speaking for them and working for them, and very rarely with them. I will decide for them. And then comes back and the group's like, no, that's not what we were saying. That's not what we've experienced. And what you did was great and kind and well-intended, but it was nowhere near what we would have wanted. And I think we dislike that because it's easier to jump to, I will do acts of compassion that are rooted in my desire to alleviate your suffering. And I want to alleviate your suffering so much that I'm rushing to solve it. And I think oftentimes it masks the more subconscious thing. I'm saying I want to rush to help you, to stop your suffering, but I'm going past listening to you to solving your suffering because really deep down, I feel more uncomfortable suffering. I want to alleviate my own suffering that you have caused. And I think that's a very hard reality for empathetic and kind and well-intending people to realize, like, are you really trying to understand others on their terms? Or are you, as you're saying, I'm trying to help them? Or are you really trying to help yourself by absolving yourself of the bad feelings that you are feeling? Because if you do, compassion, the root word of it means to suffer with. And to truly show empathy and true compassion requires a whole lot of terribly uncomfortable, terribly painful, terribly doubt-inducing sitting with the other person in their suffering. But aren't we doing something? Shouldn't we be solving this? Did they tell you to? Did they say they want you to solve this yet? No, but I feel really bad. I feel like we should be doing something. I have all these skills, all this experience, all these resources that I could solve this suffering. Yeah, but first step is compassion to suffer with rather than solve for. And that I say easily, I have a harder time doing.
I was about to ask you if you can share with me the last time you've done something like that.
It's in my own household. I aspire to be a kind and compassionate husband and father, but that goes into problematic fixing. And if I'm picking up, for example, I have two sons. If I pick them up from school and you mentioned at the top of the interview being uncomfortable and unusual, saying, how was your day? Or how are you? In the United States, we ask that a lot, but it's like, no, we're not really want to know. Like, I'm going to me, like, how are you? Like, well, I'm glad you asked. Things are going really terribly. I got a bad diagnosis from my doctor. My finances are in shambles. I didn't actually expect a real answer. And also, I used to get in the habit of, how was your day? And think about what the answer to that is: good, bad. And every day I was encouraging my kids, practice morally judging your day. Was it a good day or a bad day? But that's not really what most people want. It's really, how did your day feel? What emotion do you feel now? So I've taken to starting with, tell me three things about your day. And it's so routine. Now that I say, what are your three things? And this is a great hack for people out there who have maybe young people in their lives who maybe take longer to process about the day, or are maybe worried like, yeah, you're an adult, you're trying to trap me. I'm not going to tell you too much. It's just like, tell me three things about your day. They can be big, they can be small, whatever. And then I'll often, like if they, by the third time, they'll get to, yeah, and then there'll be almost like an evaluative statement. And then this thing happened and it was really frustrating. And then somebody saying, wow, that does sound like it would be frustrating for people. Is that what I'm hearing you say? And it sounds almost patronizingly simple. Like, oh, I'm just mirror. You said that was frustrating. Yeah, that must be frustrating. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, that's what I said. But they want to know that you are listening, not that you are trying to solve them. But why was that frustrating? Because that's my initial instinct. Yeah, we got a homework assignment back and it was frustrating. My first response is say, why? And they're immediately going to be like, what's the trap that dad's trying to send us down? As opposed to, that does sound frustrating. Can you tell me a little more about that? Well, it's frustrating. And then they start to lead the conversation rather than I'm directing them to something. And it takes a lot longer than I would like because they're my sons. I love them. I want to solve it. I want to alleviate them of their frustration. And they don't want their frustration alleviated. They want me to demonstrate the trust in them that they will have the skills to alleviate their own frustration. And they want me to prove that I love them enough to not be annoyed by the temporary problem of frustration that exists, that I want to solve them. Instead, simply being like, so am I understanding you correctly? What more would you like to say about that? And if oftentimes, nothing. And I say, okay. And sometimes we drive home for 20 minutes in silence, but that is me understanding them. Not that I get it, but I am standing under them. You don't want to talk? I'm not going to make you. You want to interpret the homework assignment as frustrating? I won't say, well, what are some other ways we could interpret it? Let me wrench your emotional experience away from you to tell you how you should be feeling. And a lot of this, I started thinking about more and more. So have racialized experiences with racialized police violence multiple times in my life.
Wow.
Multiple. Like guns drawn, handcuffs in the cell. And I'm like, I've done nothing. And then been released, charges dropped multiple times. And during the summer of 2020, with the murder of George Floyd and other high profile murders of racialized police violence, the amount of situations I had to sit in with people who have never experienced that, whose background and social identity means they will never experience it, who were somehow had the audacity to tell me how I was supposed to feel about the situation. I'm like, oh, please tell me more what it's like to be arrested as a Black man in the United States, white person. And then I started thinking about like, well, Justin, that's very easy for you. But which ways are you doing that for other people? In which ways, Justin, as a man, are you mansplaining to women like, well, I think this about sex. I don't know if I'm like, no one asked you. Or as a cisgender person, interpreting trans issues, or in that car on the ride home, Justin the dad interpreting to his children how they're supposed to feel about the situation, as opposed to showing, I am trying to understand you. I validate and I mirror back and I see and I recognize and I validate your experience in a whole world that wants to invalidate. I said, nope, it's not a big problem. The problem is with you. The issue is with you. It's not the homework assignment. It's your problem with it.
Mm.
And whether that's from a social issue, like, oh no, the world and society is just and fair, or even we often do it from a well-intended approach of toxic positivity. Oh, you're feeling a negative emotion in any way? Let me snip that right away. You're supposed to feel happy about everything all the time, which I don't know if nipping in the bud helps things bloom into the flowers they might be, as opposed to, no, rather than solving you or telling you how you're supposed to feel like everybody else, let me just provide a vehicle for your own self-actualization by showing you I am trying to understand and never assuming that I do. I get excited about this. I'm sorry.
That's really cool. I'm hearing a lot of active listening in the way that you interact with your kids. And you also remind me a lot of my time with my mother. Like there was time that I shared things that didn't happen well in my day. And I could see that she hold on the urge to help me with solving the problem. And she just patiently sitting there. And all of a sudden I visualized that the two of us just sitting in the dark because of my sadness of the day. And all of a sudden, the sunlight coming up because I now have time to process all of that thoughts and ready to step out of it. So I really appreciate hearing it from your perspective as a parent as well.
I
I'm
just want to
loving
say
these
it's very,
conversations, and I know that I derail a lot, but at the same time, I learn a lot from your stories too. So thank you so much for your energy and sharing that. Before we move to the last part of this episode, is there anything else you want to share about empathy or any other stories that you'd like to share with us?
I'd like to mirror back what I heard you saying about having the space to process on your own terms. Again, I don't know. I was hardwired to assume that, I mentioned Socratic questioning. What's interesting about Socrates, and I ask questions, is the assumption that people already have the answers and they've forgotten them. So I don't necessarily have the neuroscience or the ontological evidence to prove that, but it has very much been something that is stubbornly hardwired in me. The assumption that everybody already knows their own answers and just forgotten them. And they just need the world to be quiet long enough for them to resurrect those answers. So that idea of giving space and giving time for people to process on their own. They don't have it. We very rarely have it. We have, by the time you walk from your office to your door at home, we are bombarded with messages trying to tell us how we're supposed to feel about stuff and what we're supposed to do, as opposed to quiet and emptiness and stillness and silence enough to process on our own. So I know it doesn't show, and that's what I'm going to say. This is very strange. This is way more talking than I would normally do in a conversation. And I would normally be asking you all the questions, but
I heard you
having
on your
space.
episodes. Yeah.
I know your listeners will be like, wait, this was a different episode. But I think it's an honor to be able to provide people space. They're in conversation with you. Oh, we're going to a coffee. I'm going to be with you for 45 minutes. I will give you emptiness and silence and stillness for you to process through stuff, because otherwise it's not there usually.
I think you touch on that very important foundational of the coach and coachee relationship, right? And again, that's why I respect working with coaches, because sometimes we forget to allow us the space to process not only the information we have, but also all the questions that we have in ourselves. So I really appreciate, all of my coach and these conversations. Sometimes that's all we need, the allowance for us to have the space to process our thoughts and draw out the answers. This is really cool. So I want to move to the last part of our episode. In respect for our time, I think we can continue the conversation.
I'm good. However long you want.
So what's next for you in the coming 12 months?
So a lot of this work I'm beginning to kind of formulate into a book. So my life partner, business partner, Deanna Singh, has a fantastic book called Actions Speak Louder. And that very much focuses on kind of the programmatic things like mentoring best practices and meeting norms that can create a culture of inclusivity. And the next book that we're working on is going to be kind of shifting away from that programmatic approach to much more individual competencies. So we all know quite a few things that, hey, to create a culture of inclusion where everybody feels validated and we can have not just diversity of identity, but diversity of ideas that help us solve all the world's problems requires inclusive meeting norms where I can say things that are unpopular, that defy groupthink and help us think new thoughts as opposed to spinning in the same wheel. But immediately the question becomes, and the training that we've done, the work that we've done in response to that book is, what about the people who are never going to have control over those meetings or don't have the buy-in and enthusiastic support to make those changes to the meeting? So we're going to be focusing much more on kind of individual competencies of what people can do almost along the lines of micro inclusions. So you mentioned a few things like active listening. Empathy is going to be a huge part of that. Mirroring, what does active listening look like? What does it mean to give space? How can I do this? And how can I do these small things that help people feel rehumanized in a world and an experience, and often in workplaces that do a lot to dehumanize them?
I just thought of multiple questions from that. You know what? I'll save it until you launch a new book and then perhaps we can unpack that. I really just go back to that bit of, mirroring very quickly. I love that term of mirroring because all of a sudden I can again have space to introspect on the things that are going on and find out some actions and what to do about it. But sometimes I confused the concept of mirroring and code switching.
Mm.
Do you have a way to differentiate those two terms for me?
So code switching, the ultimate goal would be to conform. It is my self-preservation to fit in and not cause problems. Another part of my academic background was in African American literature. And there's a figure that goes from Yoruba and Igbo religions and languages that came with African enslaved people. And it was the figure of Esu Alegba, who is the trickster figure. And many different traditions have trickster figures who teach through cunning. So I mentioned before Socrates, his buddy Plato, and we get a lot of stuff from that tradition where the ultimate virtue for society and for social good. And Plato's Republic, the first thing he does is bans the poets because they lie. Poetry is, I reform and I mix words together to present a reality that doesn't actually exist. And in Plato's world, that's a lie. And he goes through very interesting things about the types of hunting and fishing he would ban in his perfect republic. He would ban traps. He would ban fishing hooks. Why? Because those are inherently deceptive and they trick people. They trick the fish. They trick the deer rather than teaching the hunter and the fisher to be ethical and honest and open with their hunting and their fishing. That's not my tradition. My tradition is a whole lot of people in very difficult situations who did not have the luxury of being honest and straightforward, whose virtue and trickster figures were cunning. So I used Frederick Douglass. He tricked people into teaching him how to read and write. In his time and place, It was illegal for enslaved people to read or write. Not even just enslaved people, for Black people at all to read and write. There could be very high punishments, all the way up to death. And it was very high punishments for any white person to teach any Black person how to read and write. Because what it meant, especially for enslaved people, if I'm walking and the slaver says, you walk from Charlotte to Birmingham by yourself, and you carry this paper, if anyone stops me and I know how to write, I can write my own pass saying, this is Justin, my slave. He's supposed to go to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And if I show that, that is the key to my freedom. So Frederick Douglass tricks white boys that he lived around, the mistress of the plantation, into teaching him how to read and write. And then he uses that reading and writing to escape from slavery, only to go back into it. And if you read the oratory of Frederick Douglass, my favorite is the one that he gives on the 4th of July to a room full of abolitionists. And it's like, what is the 4th of July to the Negro slave? And it's like, and it is this brilliant, tricky, cunning, trickster-like Issue-Elegba piece of oratory where he's complimenting them on all the great things they've done. And they're feeling really great about themselves. And then there's all these really scathing points in there where he's like, yeah, you need to be better. So in these moments, the code switching would be, what do I have to do to get by to conform? But compassion requires a certain amount of cunning too. It's the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go brown. It's the mozzarella cheese sprinkled on the broccoli to help people get their vegetables. It's like asking questions, but every once in a while earning trust and sliding in a question that challenges people to be the best version of themselves. So I think that's the difference between code switching. The goal is to conform and preserve my own safety. But true compassion also has a certain amount of cunning in it. It's like, how can I nudge you without a full frontal assault? Because the full frontal assault that we pride ourselves on being real, keeping it 100, being authentic, I don't have any organizational psychology evidence that proves that works. But compassionate, trust, earning people's trust, and then slowly feeding out questions that nudge them to think more and be better, that works. But it also requires not just code switching, it requires a certain amount of what we might think is cunning in a deceptive way that Plato would hate as part of his republic. But Frederick Douglass would say, no, this is the essential element of a more just society.
I can hear a lot of intentionality in different ways to use those approaches too. Thank you for explaining it to me. So bring back to the theme of this episode on empathy and go back to your coming 12 months. My question for you is how does empathy fit into your plans of the coming 12 months?
So empathy is focused much more on kind of the individual. It becomes hard to empathize with an entire group. Empathy almost requires the particularity of individual experience. So across the next 12 months, focusing much more on individual coaching, individual conversations, developing skills for people to do in one-on-one interactions like this, having the one-on-one kind of micro inclusions. And when we are speaking now, and I don't know what things will be like when this episode airs, but the work that I do, diversity, equity, inclusion, it's how can we create cultures of inclusion and belonging where everyone can thrive? And that is being misrepresented in ways I don't understand and feel a lot of hurt about, and being politicized as something way different than what it is intended to be and what in reality it often is. And we work with lots of organizations that are seeing their funding around inclusion attacked, lied about, misrepresented, and taken away. But what will still remain, no matter what the political winds turn, is the problem, quote unquote, problem of difference. The world is full of difference. It is a core part of human existence and the human experience. You can ban all the DEI programs that ever existed. You're still going to encounter people who are different. You're still going to encounter groups that are different, working styles, cultures, entire histories of meaning making that are different. And even if it's not different between people, you're going to encounter change. These are inevitable parts of human experience. There will be something that comes along, an event that is completely different, and we don't know how to adapt to it. So the problem of difference will still remain, and the need for adaptation will always remain. And the keys to adaptation will always still remain empathy, humility, patience, listening, understanding. No matter what the political environment, no matter what is said about DEI practitioners, or Justin Ponder, I will still encounter people who are different than me. I will still encounter a time and context that is different than the one I'm comfortable in. I will have to figure out how to adapt to it. And the only ways I can is through humility, patience, understanding, and empathy. Those are things that are not political. Those are things that are core to being a good human that will not go away.
Thank you for wrap up the episode for me. I do have one last question, and hopefully you have fun with it. So imagine that you are going on your dream vacation tomorrow. What is the one item that you would take with you and why?
So of course I'd bring my people. They're not items, my family, but the item would be a notebook to write things down in. I love photos. They're fantastic. It's great having a phone, but sometimes I worry that it takes me out of the present moment and I become almost more interested in taking a photo of the thing than being in the place. But what I do like about writing is then it would be, every day, Justin, be as present as possible, be as mindful as possible. Take this all in. So tonight you can write about it. So 10 years from now, you can remember what lessons you learned from this moment.
Nice. Thank you so much for that. And that is the end of the episode. Thank you again for your time and sharing your story with us. I will
The
stop.
pleasure is all mine. Thank you for the opportunity.
That's it for today's episode. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. I'd love to hear your take on the chosen keyword. Have a lovely time, and thank you again for spending time with Humans of Authenticity.